The American Revolution, which began in 1775 and culminated in 1783, is one of the most significant turning points in history, not only for the United States but for the world. The 13 American colonies, under British rule for over a century, embarked on a revolutionary struggle that would transform them from subjugated territories into an independent nation. This victory against the most powerful empire of the time, the British Empire, was far from a foregone conclusion. It was an improbable and audacious rebellion, marked by intense military conflict, revolutionary ideology, and a relentless pursuit of self-determination. Causes of the Revolution. The roots of the American Revolution lay in a combination of political, economic, and social factors. The colonies, while enjoying a degree of self-governance, were increasingly angered by what they saw as unjust British policies. British imposed taxes such as the Stamp Act, 1765, and the Townshend Acts, 1767, without representation in Parliament fueled discontent. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry for colonists who believed that they should have the right to self-govern and control their own economic destiny. The Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773 were key flashpoints that escalated tensions. Additionally, the Enlightenment ideas of natural rights, liberty, and the social contract, popularized by philosophers like John Locke, played a crucial role in shaping the ideological framework of the Revolution. Many colonial leaders, including Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, were heavily influenced by these ideas. They began to view British rule as an infringement on their God-given rights, not just as subjects of a distant monarchy, but as free individuals deserving of self-rule. These Enlightenment principles became foundational to the American cause, articulating the vision of a new, independent nation built on democracy, freedom, and equality. The War for Independence. The conflict officially began in April 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Initially, the colonial forces were poorly equipped and lacked formal training, while the British Army was one of the most formidable military forces in the world. Yet, the Americans were driven by a deep sense of purpose and were able to use their knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla tactics, and an unyielding will to resist occupation. Leaders like George Washington, who would later become the first president of the United States, provided the necessary leadership to unite the colonies and organize the Continental Army. Despite early setbacks, including the loss of key cities like New York, the Americans managed to turn the tide of the war. Crucial victories at Saratoga in 1777, where British forces were decisively defeated, shifted the momentum in favor of the colonists. This victory was particularly significant because it convinced France, who had long been resentful of British power, to enter the war as an ally of the American cause. French military aid, including supplies, troops, and naval support, proved to be a game-changer. This international alliance would ultimately prove decisive in the final defeat of the British. The war itself was not just about military engagements. It was also a battle of ideas and diplomacy. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, was a bold proclamation that severed ties with the British monarchy and justified the colony's right to self-govern. The document, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, was not only a call for independence but also an eloquent expression of the new nation's ideals, liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. It inspired not only Americans but also countless people around the world who were fighting for their own freedom. The Treaty of Paris, 1783. The war formally ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The British, exhausted by years of war and unable to sustain their empire's hold over distant colonies, agreed to recognize American independence. The treaty granted the United States significant territorial gains, including land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to Florida. The victory in the Revolution and the subsequent recognition of American sovereignty laid the groundwork for the expansion of the United States and its future rise as a world power. Significance of the American Revolution. The success of the American Revolution had profound global implications. It marked the first time in modern history that a colony had successfully rebelled against a European imperial power and established its independence. This created a powerful precedent for other nations and peoples seeking freedom. The American Revolution sparked revolutions around the world, most notably in France, Latin America, and even parts of Europe, where the ideas of liberty and self-determination began to take root. The revolution also demonstrated the power of democratic principles in shaping the destiny of a nation. The United States, though a relatively small and newly formed country, was now a beacon of democracy and a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The revolution's success sent a message that the age of monarchy and imperialism might be giving way to an era of self-governing republics. Moreover, the revolution helped solidify the idea that political and economic systems should serve the people, not the other way around. This view was embodied in the United States' eventual system of government, where the people elect their leaders, and those leaders are bound by a constitution that guarantees individual rights. The beginning of America's global ambitions. In many ways, the American Revolution can be seen as the first step toward America's rise to global prominence. While the young nation was far from a superpower at the time, the revolution set into motion the forces that would allow it to grow in power and influence over the next 2 centuries. The success of the revolution provided the United States with the credibility and political stability needed to pursue its interests on the global stage. The defeat of Britain also marked the end of an era of European dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Over the years that followed, the U.S. would assert its influence in North America and later the world, solidifying its place in international politics. This idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States had a unique role to play in spreading democracy and freedom, would later become a defining feature of American foreign policy. In conclusion, the American Revolution was not just a military struggle for independence, but a philosophical, political, and ideological movement that set the foundation for the United States' future greatness. The courage and resolve of the colonists, combined with the strategic vision of their leaders, made the revolution possible. The victory in 1783 didn't just mean freedom from British rule. It marked the beginning of a new era where a young, dynamic nation would begin to carve out its place in the world. The American Revolution was a pivotal moment that marked the birth of a new power, one that would rise to become a superpower in the centuries that followed. The creation of the United States Constitution in 1787 was not merely an administrative or legal act. It was the foundational moment that established the United States as a unique political entity, one built on democratic principles that would influence the entire world. After the success of the American Revolution, the newly independent states faced an immense challenge: how to create a unified and stable government that could govern a diverse and growing nation. The Articles of Confederation, which had served as the first governing document of the United States, proved inadequate. They created a weak central government that lacked the power to regulate commerce, enforce laws, or raise taxes. By the mid-1780s, it was clear that a new system of governance was needed to ensure the survival and prosperity of the American experiment. The Constitutional Convention. In May 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island did not participate, gathered in Philadelphia for what would become known as the Constitutional Convention. The goal of the convention was originally to amend the Articles of Confederation, but it quickly became apparent that a complete overhaul of the system was necessary. The men who gathered in Philadelphia were not only politically astute, but many of them were also deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. These ideas on the rights of individuals, the separation of powers, and the importance of checks and balances formed the intellectual backbone of the new Constitution. The core principles of the Constitution. The result of the Constitutional Convention was a document that laid the groundwork for a government that balanced the power of the states with the power of the federal government. It established a framework for a republic, with elected representatives serving the will of the people, but also incorporating safeguards to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. Federalism. The Constitution established a federal system of government, dividing power between the national government and the states. This system was designed to address the concerns of both those who feared a powerful central government, such as the Anti-Federalists, and those who wanted to ensure national unity and strength, such as the Federalists. By creating a balance of power, federalism ensured that neither the states nor the national government could become too dominant. Separation of powers and checks and balances. One of the most innovative aspects of the U.S. Constitution was its design for a separation of powers. The Constitution created 3 branches of government: the executive, the president, the legislative, Congress, and the judicial, the courts. Each branch was given distinct powers and responsibilities, but also the ability to limit the powers of the others through a system of checks and balances. For example, The president could veto laws passed by Congress, but Congress could override the veto with a supermajority. The courts could declare laws unconstitutional, thus ensuring that no branch or individual could accumulate too much power. Republicanism and the role of the people. At the heart of the Constitution was the belief that government should derive its authority from the consent of the governed. This republican form of government meant that the people would elect their leaders through regular, free, and fair elections. While the Constitution initially did not allow all people to vote, excluding women, slaves, and non-property-owning men, the idea that the government should reflect the will of the people was revolutionary. Over time, amendments to the Constitution expanded voting rights to include more segments of the population. Protection of individual rights. Although the original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, the framers understood the importance of protecting individual freedoms. James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, was initially opposed to the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, believing that the Constitution itself was sufficient to protect liberty. However, in response to calls from states and citizens, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added in 1791. These amendments guaranteed fundamental freedoms such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to a fair trial, and protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. These rights became a critical part of the American identity and a model for other nations striving for democratic governance. The ratification debate. The ratification of the Constitution was not a simple or unanimous process. In order to take effect, the document had to be approved by conventions in at least 9 of the 13 states. This process sparked a national debate between those in favor of the new Constitution, called Federalists, and those who opposed it, called Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, including prominent figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, argued that a stronger central government was necessary to maintain order, promote economic stability, and secure the nation's future. In contrast, the Anti-Federalists feared that the new Constitution would create a central government too powerful and distant from the people, leading to tyranny and the erosion of individual liberties. To persuade the public, the Federalists published a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers, which explained and defended the provisions of the Constitution. These essays remain a key resource for understanding the intentions behind the Constitution and the principles it embodies. The Anti-Federalists, meanwhile, raised important concerns about the lack of explicit protections for individual rights, which ultimately led to the inclusion of the Bill of Rights as a condition for ratification. A living document. The United States Constitution is often referred to as a living document because of its flexibility and ability to evolve with the times. Unlike many other national constitutions, which are rigid and difficult to amend, the U.S. Constitution allows for amendments to be made through a process that balances stability with change. This adaptability has allowed the Constitution to remain relevant for over 2 centuries, providing a stable foundation for the country while also responding to new challenges. Since its ratification, the Constitution has been amended 27 times, with key changes such as the expansion of voting rights, including the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment and the granting of women's suffrage through the 19th Amendment, and the establishment of civil rights protections, such as the 14th and 15th Amendments. These amendments reflect the nation's ongoing struggle to live up to its ideals of equality and freedom, ensuring that the government remains responsive to the needs of its people. Global impact of the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was not only a groundbreaking document in the context of American history but also had a profound impact on the world. The Constitution's emphasis on the separation of powers, checks and balances, and the protection of individual rights became a model for other countries seeking to establish democratic governments. In the 19th and 20th centuries, many nations, particularly in Europe and Latin America, looked to the U.S. Constitution as a guide when drafting their own constitutions and establishing democratic institutions. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century and continued into the 19th century, was one of the most transformative periods in history, and its effects were particularly profound in the United States. While it is often associated with Britain, where it first took root, the United States would go on to experience its own unique industrial revolution that would play a central role in the nation's rise to superpower status. The transition from an agrarian economy to an industrialized one reshaped not just the American economy, but also its society, culture, and global standing. Early stages of industrialization. The seeds of industrialization in the United States were sown in the years following the American Revolution. During the early years of the new republic, the United States was primarily an agrarian economy. Most Americans lived on farms or in rural areas, and industries such as textiles, iron, and shipbuilding existed in small-scale, localized settings. However, several factors would begin to set the stage for large-scale industrialization. One of the most important of these factors was the rise of technological innovation. The United States, with its vast natural resources, such as coal, iron ore, timber, and oil, was well positioned to support industrial growth. In the early 19th century, new inventions began to emerge that would radically alter the way goods were produced, transported, and consumed. The textile industry, for example, saw the advent of new machinery such as the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, which dramatically increased the speed and efficiency of cotton processing, fueling the growth of cotton plantations in the South. The role of technology and innovation. Technological innovations were crucial to America's industrial rise. As the 19th century progressed, a series of inventions revolutionized manufacturing processes. In 1807, Robert Fulton's successful application of steam power to his steamboat, the Claremont, marked a milestone in transportation, enabling goods and people to move more quickly and efficiently along America's rivers. The development of the steam engine, initially popularized by James Watt in Britain, was a key driver of both transportation and industrial power in the U.S. Similarly, the construction of the first transcontinental railroad in the 1860s, made possible by innovations in steel production and the use of mechanized construction techniques, transformed the country. It not only connected the East and West Coasts, but also made it easier to transport raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets. The railroad became the backbone of the U.S. economy, facilitating trade and encouraging westward expansion. One of the most significant technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. was the rise of mass production techniques. The development of interchangeable parts, pioneered by figures like Eli Whitney and Simeon North, revolutionized manufacturing by making it possible to produce goods more efficiently and at a lower cost. This laid the foundation for the rise of large factories and the expansion of industries such as textiles, iron and steel, and later, automobiles. By the mid-19th century, American industries were beginning to outpace those of Europe in terms of production and efficiency. Expansion of key industries. The Industrial Revolution in the United States saw the rise of several key industries that would become the pillars of the economy. The textile industry, especially in New England, was one of the first to fully embrace industrialization. In cities like Lowell, Massachusetts, mills sprang up that could produce textiles at a scale never seen before, powered by water wheels and later steam engines. By the 1820s and 1830s, New England had become the center of the American textile industry, exporting finished fabrics and contributing to the growth of the U.S. economy. The iron and steel industry also saw dramatic changes during this period. Early in the century, the U.S. was importing most of its iron from Europe, but by the mid-1800s, the discovery of new iron deposits and the development of more efficient smelting techniques, such as the Bessemer process, allowed the U.S. to become a major producer of steel. Steel became an essential component of everything from railroads to buildings to military equipment, and the U.S. began to dominate global steel production by the end of the 19th century. The rise of manufacturing and mass production also led to the birth of America's great industrial giants. Figures like Andrew Carnegie, who built the Carnegie Steel Company into the world's largest steel producer, and John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil Company controlled much of the oil industry, epitomized the success of American industrialization. These men, often referred to as captains of industry or robber barons, not only accumulated immense wealth but also transformed their industries, often through aggressive business practices, monopolies, and vertical integration. Urbanization and labor. As industry boomed, so too did urbanization. Cities like New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit became magnets for both domestic and international migration, as people sought employment in the factories and mills. The promise of industrial jobs brought millions of immigrants to the U.S. from Europe and Asia, fueling population growth and urban expansion. However, this rapid urbanization also brought significant challenges. Factory work was often grueling and dangerous, with long hours, poor working conditions, and low wages. Child labor was common, as families needed the income and children could be paid less than adults. The rise of labor unions during the late 19th century was a direct response to these conditions, as workers organized to demand better wages, working hours, and safety standards. Strikes, protests, and even violent confrontations between workers and management became common as the labor movement gained momentum. Despite these challenges, industrialization also created a new middle class, an emerging group of managers, engineers, and professionals who found new opportunities in the growing industrial economy. This middle class was a significant driver of American consumerism, as rising incomes allowed more Americans to buy products like clothing, household goods, and even automobiles. The economic impact. The economic impact of the Industrial Revolution was profound. By the late 19th century, the United States had become one of the world's leading industrial powers, producing goods for both domestic consumption and international export. The rise of large-scale factories and the growth of industries such as textiles, steel, oil, and transportation created a highly productive economy that was capable of sustaining a growing population. The U.S. also emerged as a leader in technological innovation, with American inventors and entrepreneurs pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The development of mass production, combined with abundant natural resources and an expanding consumer market, made the U.S. an industrial powerhouse. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century and continued into the 19th century, was one of the most transformative periods in history, and its effects were particularly profound in the United States. While it is often associated with Britain, where it first took root, the United States would go on to experience its own unique industrial revolution that would play a central role in the nation's rise to superpower status. The transition from an agrarian economy to an industrialized one reshaped not just the American economy, but also its society, culture, and global standing. Early stages of industrialization. The seeds of industrialization in the United States were sown in the years following the American Revolution. During the early years of the new republic, the United States was primarily an agrarian economy. Most Americans lived on farms or in rural areas, and industries such as textiles, iron, and shipbuilding existed in small-scale, localized settings. However, several factors would begin to set the stage for large-scale industrialization. One of the most important of these factors was the rise of technological innovation. The United States, with its vast natural resources, such as coal, iron ore, timber, and oil, was well-positioned to support industrial growth. In the early 19th century, new inventions began to emerge that would radically alter the way goods were produced, transported, and consumed. The textile industry, for example, saw the advent of new machinery such as the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, which dramatically increased the speed and efficiency of cotton processing, fueling the growth of cotton plantations in the South. The role of technology and innovation. Technological innovations were crucial to America's industrial rise. As the 19th century progressed, a series of inventions revolutionized manufacturing processes. In 1807, Robert Fulton's successful application of steam power to his steamboat, the Clermont, marked a milestone in transportation, enabling goods and people to move more quickly and efficiently along America's rivers. The development of the steam engine, initially popularized by James Watt in Britain, was a key driver of both transportation and industrial power in the U.S. Similarly, the construction of the first transcontinental railroad in the 1860s, made possible by innovations in steel production and the use of mechanized construction techniques, transformed the country. It not only connected the East and West Coast but also made it easier to transport raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets. The railroad became the backbone of the U.S. economy, facilitating trade and encouraging westward expansion. One of the most significant technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. was the rise of mass production techniques. The development of interchangeable parts, pioneered by figures like Eli Whitney and Simeon North, revolutionized manufacturing by making it possible to produce goods more efficiently and at a lower cost. This laid the foundation for the rise of large factories and the expansion of industries such as textiles, iron and steel, and later, automobiles. By the mid-19th century, American industries were beginning to outpace those of Europe in terms of production and efficiency. Expansion of key industries. The Industrial Revolution in the United States saw the rise of several key industries that would become the pillars of the economy. The textile industry, especially in New England, was one of the first to fully embrace industrialization. In cities like Lowell, Massachusetts, mills sprang up that could produce textiles at a scale never seen before, powered by water wheels and later steam engines. By the 1820s and 1830s, New England had become the center of the American textile industry, exporting finished fabrics and contributing to the growth of the U.S. economy. The iron and steel industry also saw dramatic changes during this period. Early in the century, the U.S. was importing most of its iron from Europe, but by the mid-1800s, the discovery of new iron deposits and the development of more efficient smelting techniques, such as the Bessemer process, allowed the U.S. to become a major producer of steel. Steel became an essential component of everything from railroads to buildings to military equipment, and the U.S. began to dominate global steel production by the end of the 19th century. The rise of manufacturing and mass production also led to the birth of America's great industrial giants. Figures like Andrew Carnegie, who built the Carnegie Steel Company into the world's largest steel producer, and John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil Company controlled much of the oil industry, epitomized the success of American industrialization. These men, often referred to as captains of industry or robber barons, not only accumulated immense wealth but also transformed their industries, often through aggressive business practices, monopolies, and vertical integration. Urbanization and labor. As industry boomed, so too did urbanization. Cities like New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit became magnets for both domestic and international migration, as people sought employment in the factories and mills. The promise of industrial jobs brought millions of immigrants to the U.S. from Europe and Asia, fueling population growth and urban expansion. However, this rapid urbanization also brought significant challenges. Factory work was often grueling and dangerous, with long hours, poor working conditions, and low wages. Child labor was common, as families needed the income and children could be paid less than adults. The rise of labor unions during the late 19th century was a direct response to these conditions, as workers organized to demand better wages, working hours, and safety standards. Strikes, protests, and even violent confrontations between workers and management became common as the labor movement gained momentum. Despite these challenges, industrialization also created a new middle class, an emerging group of managers, engineers, and professionals who found new opportunities in the growing industrial economy. This middle class was a significant driver of American consumerism, as rising incomes allowed more Americans to buy products like clothing, household goods, and even automobiles. The economic impact. The economic impact of the Industrial Revolution was profound. By the late 19th century, the United States had become one of the world's leading industrial powers, producing goods for both domestic consumption and international export. The rise of large-scale factories and the growth of industries such as textiles, steel, oil, and transportation created a highly productive economy that was capable of sustaining a growing population. The U.S. also emerged as a leader in technological innovation, with American inventors and entrepreneurs pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The development of mass production, combined with abundant natural resources and an expanding consumer market, made the U.S. an industrial powerhouse. The displacement of Native Americans continued throughout the 19th century, as the U.S. government signed a series of treaties that were often violated and engaged in military campaigns to suppress Native resistance. By the end of the century, the vast majority of Native American tribes had been removed from their ancestral lands, and many were confined to reservations in the western U.S. The Homestead Act and Settlement. In 1862, the U.S. government passed the Homestead Act, which offered 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to settle and improve it. This policy was designed to encourage the settlement of the West and the establishment of farming communities. The Homestead Act was a significant driver of westward expansion, as it provided opportunities for thousands of Americans, including immigrants and former slaves, to own land and build new lives. The act led to the establishment of vast farming communities across the Great Plains, although it also created challenges, including conflicts with Native Americans, environmental difficulties, and the hardships of frontier life. Nonetheless, the Homestead Act helped transform the U.S. into an agricultural powerhouse and facilitated the development of the western states, further solidifying the nation's control over the continent. The role of the government and military. The federal government played a key role in facilitating the expansion process, from military campaigns to building infrastructure. The government's actions, ranging from treaties with Native American tribes to the funding of the Transcontinental Railroad, helped ensure the movement of settlers and the establishment of U.S. control over vast swaths of territory. Additionally, the military was often used to suppress Native American resistance and maintain order in newly acquired lands. The U.S. military played a central role in the Indian Wars, which stretched throughout much of the 19th century. These conflicts, often brutal and asymmetrical, were part of the broader effort to secure U.S. control over the West. The military also helped protect settlers and enforce the laws of the expanding territories, ensuring that the federal government's authority extended across the continent. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, stands as one of the most defining moments in the history of the United States. It was a brutal conflict that tore the nation apart, but ultimately led to the preservation of the Union and the end of slavery. The war was not just a military struggle, but also a contest of ideas, values, and systems of governance. The outcome of the Civil War had far-reaching implications, both for the development of the U.S. as a superpower and for the country's moral and political trajectory. Furthermore, the post-war period of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, sought to rebuild the South, integrate freed African Americans into society, and redefine the relationship between the federal government and the states. The Civil War and Reconstruction were pivotal in the transformation of the United States into a more unified, industrialized, and politically powerful nation. The causes of the Civil War. The roots of the Civil War can be traced to deep divisions in American society, primarily between the northern and southern states. The primary cause of the conflict was slavery, but there were other contributing factors that escalated tensions, including economic disparities, regional political ideologies, and questions about states' rights. Slavery and its expansion. By the mid-19th century, the northern and southern states had diverged dramatically in terms of their economies and social structures. The South relied heavily on an agricultural economy based on slavery, particularly in the cultivation of cotton, tobacco, and rice. In contrast, the North had become more industrialized and urbanized, with an economy driven by manufacturing and trade. The issue of whether slavery should be allowed to expand into newly acquired territories in the West was a point of contention that intensified sectionalism. The Southern states saw the preservation and expansion of slavery as essential to their way of life and economic prosperity, while many in the North, especially in the emerging Republican Party, sought to prevent its spread. States' rights versus federal authority. Another issue that contributed to the conflict was the ongoing debate over states' rights. Southern states believed that the federal government had no right to interfere with the institution of slavery, particularly in the territories, and that they should have the authority to make decisions for themselves without federal intervention. Northern politicians, on the other hand, believed that the Union must be preserved and that the federal government had the power to regulate slavery in the territories. The election of Abraham Lincoln. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 marked a tipping point. Lincoln, representing the newly formed Republican Party, was opposed to the expansion of slavery into the territories, though he initially stated that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. Nonetheless, his election was seen as a threat to the Southern way of life, leading to a wave of secession. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860, followed by 6 other Southern states by the time Lincoln took office in March 1861. They formed the Confederate States of America, a new nation dedicated to preserving slavery and states' rights. The Civil War. The Civil War began in earnest in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked the federal military garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The conflict quickly escalated into a full-scale war between the Union, the North, and the Confederacy, the South. The war lasted 4 years and saw some of the most intense and bloody battles in American history. It fundamentally reshaped the country in ways that would echo for generations. The role of slavery in the war. While initially the Union's goal was to preserve the Union, slavery became an increasingly important issue as the war progressed. In 1862, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territories were to be freed. This executive order had several key effects. It weakened the Confederacy's economy, galvanized the abolitionist cause, and allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. By the end of the war, the issue of slavery was no longer a peripheral concern but the central moral and political issue of the conflict. The role of African Americans. African Americans played a critical role in the Union War effort. Over 180,000 African American soldiers and sailors served in the Union Army and Navy, many of them freed slaves who had escaped to Union lines or African Americans living in the North. Their contributions were instrumental in the Union's eventual victory, and their service helped to reshape American society. The Union Army's recruitment of African American soldiers represented a crucial step toward the recognition of African Americans as citizens and participants in the American political system. The cost of the war. The Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history, with an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers killed. The war also resulted in significant economic costs, particularly for the southern states, whose infrastructure was decimated. The South's economy, which had been heavily reliant on slavery and agriculture, was left in ruins, while the North's industrial base allowed it to recover more quickly. The end of the Civil War and the assassination of Lincoln. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, with the surrender of General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army to General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. However, the finality of the Confederate surrender did not end the bitter divisions that had led to the war. Less than a week after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Lincoln's death left a profound sense of national mourning and uncertainty, but it also elevated Vice President Andrew Johnson to the presidency. Reconstruction. Reconstruction refers to the period after the Civil War in which the United States sought to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved African Americans into society as free citizens. It was a complex and contentious process, with stark divisions over how to address the legacy of slavery, the status of the South, and the rights of newly freed African Americans. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. One of the most significant outcomes of Reconstruction was the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship to anyone born in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people, and guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, 1870, gave African American men the right to vote, thus formally extending political rights to African Americans. These amendments laid the legal foundation for civil rights in the U.S., although their full promise would not be realized until much later in the 20th century. The Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, was one of the first federal agencies designed to assist former slaves in the transition to freedom. The Bureau helped to provide food, clothing, medical care, and education, as well as legal assistance to freed African Americans. It played a crucial role in supporting African Americans in the South during the early years of Reconstruction. Radical Reconstruction and the role of Congress. The most aggressive phase of Reconstruction, known as Radical Reconstruction, was led by Congress and sought to secure the rights of African Americans and ensure their full participation in American political life. The Radical Republicans, who dominated Congress, passed laws that provided for the military occupation of the South, established new state governments that were more inclusive of African Americans, and imposed strict conditions for Southern states to rejoin the Union. Resistance in the South. Reconstruction faced intense resistance from many white Southerners, who resented the changes being forced upon them. The rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, during this time reflected the deep-seated racial animosity in the South. These groups used violence and intimidation to undermine Reconstruction efforts, particularly the efforts to grant African Americans political rights. The end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction effectively ended in 1877 when federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of the Compromise of 1877, which resolved the contested 1876 presidential election. This withdrawal marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era, during which Southern states enacted laws to segregate and disenfranchise African Americans, effectively reversing many of the gains made during Reconstruction. The legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The Civil War and Reconstruction had a profound impact on the United States, both in the short term and the long term. The war preserved the Union, ensured the abolition of slavery, and paved the way for the civil rights struggles of the 20th century. While Reconstruction's immediate success was limited, particularly in the South, the legal and constitutional changes it brought about laid the foundation for future progress in the fight for racial equality. The legacy of the Civil War continues to shape American society today, as issues of race, civil rights, and national unity remain central to the American experience. In the long term, the Civil War and Reconstruction helped solidify the United States as a more unified nation. The war, by resolving the question of secession, affirmed the supremacy of the federal government and set the stage for the country's emergence as an industrialized superpower in the years to come. The transformation of the South, though incomplete, set the stage for later social and political movements, and the legal changes brought about during Reconstruction would inspire future generations to continue the struggle for civil rights. The period following the Civil War, known as the Gilded Age, approximately 1870 to 1900, was a time of rapid industrialization, economic expansion, and profound social change in the United States. It was a time of enormous wealth and opportunity for some, but also a period of vast inequality, labor unrest, and political corruption. The Gilded Age was marked by the rise of big business and the development of powerful industrialists who would come to dominate the American economy. The consequences of this era were far-reaching, contributing to America's emergence as a global superpower by transforming its economy, culture, and political system. The rise of big business. At the heart of the Gilded Age was the unprecedented growth of big business. With the Industrial Revolution still in full swing, the United States witnessed the development of large-scale industries that were able to dominate markets both domestically and internationally. Key sectors such as railroads, steel, oil, and manufacturing underwent radical transformations, driven by technological innovations and the development of large, vertically integrated companies. The railroad industry. The railroad industry played a central role in America's economic development during the Gilded Age. Railroads had already expanded rapidly before the Civil War, but the post-war period saw a true explosion in their growth. By the 1880s, railroads were not only connecting cities and regions across the United States, but were also critical to the transportation of raw materials, manufactured goods, and agricultural products. They provided the infrastructure necessary for other industries to flourish, making it easier for factories to access resources and for products to be shipped to national and international markets. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 marked a milestone in this expansion, linking the eastern U.S. to the West Coast. Railroads were essential to the rise of cities like Chicago and Denver, and they provided a crucial transportation route for the burgeoning agricultural and mining industries in the West. The dominance of major railroad companies, such as those led by Cornelius Vanderbilt and James J. Hill, also laid the groundwork for the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few wealthy individuals. Steel and oil industries. The steel and oil industries are perhaps the most iconic examples of how big business reshaped the U.S. economy. The development of the steel industry in the late 19th century was driven by key figures like Andrew Carnegie, who founded Carnegie Steel Company in 1892. Carnegie's company revolutionized steel production with the introduction of the Bessemer process, which made steel cheaper and more efficient to produce. Carnegie's success was not just in the process but in the consolidation of the steel industry. By the end of the 19th century, Carnegie Steel became the largest steel company in the world, and Carnegie himself became one of the wealthiest men in America. In parallel, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company dominated the oil industry. Through aggressive tactics, such as horizontal integration, buying out competitors, and vertical integration, controlling all aspects of production, Rockefeller created a monopoly on oil refining, distribution, and transportation. By the turn of the century, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of the U.S. oil market. Rockefeller's business practices, while incredibly effective, were also seen as monopolistic and predatory, leading to significant public outcry and eventually to the government's efforts to regulate big business. Technological innovation and the growth of industrial power. The Gilded Age was also marked by significant technological innovation, which helped fuel industrial growth and further solidify the power of big business. These innovations not only transformed the economy but also had a profound impact on everyday life. Key technological developments included the expansion of the telegraph and telephone, the invention of electric lighting, and the rise of mechanized production techniques. The telegraph and telephone. The telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse in the 1830s, had already revolutionized long-distance communication by the time the Gilded Age began. However, the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876 further transformed communication, making it possible to transmit voice messages over long distances. This invention opened up new possibilities for businesses to coordinate operations across the country and around the world. It helped cement the dominance of telecommunications companies, such as AT&T, which would grow to control the telephone industry for much of the 20th century. Electricity and the light bulb. Another key technological advance was the development of electric power. Thomas Edison's invention of the electric light bulb in 1879 helped pave the way for the widespread adoption of electricity in homes and businesses. Edison's creation of the first electrical power station in 1882 in New York City helped establish the electric industry as one of the leading sectors of the Gilded Age economy. The ability to power factories with electricity allowed for round-the-clock production, which increased industrial output and transformed American cities. Cities like New York and Chicago were soon illuminated with electric lights, symbolizing the progress and modernity of the new industrial age. Mechanized production. One of the most important technological changes in the Gilded Age was the widespread adoption of mechanized production techniques. Henry Ford, though more famous for his innovations in the 20th century, began experimenting with mass production methods in the early 1900s. The introduction of assembly line production, especially in industries like automobiles, created an economic revolution. Factories could now produce goods more efficiently, at a lower cost, and on a larger scale than ever before. This allowed American industries to dominate global markets and fueled the rise of consumer culture, as mass-produced goods became more affordable and accessible to a wider population. The rise of monopolies and trusts. As the nation's major industries grew, so did the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few individuals and companies. The Gilded Age saw the rise of monopolies and trusts, business arrangements that allowed companies to eliminate competition and control entire industries. These monopolies, such as Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel, were often criticized for their anti-competitive practices and their influence over the political system. Horizontal and vertical integration. The two main strategies for consolidating business power during the Gilded Age were horizontal integration and vertical integration. Horizontal integration involved buying out competitors to reduce competition and increase market share. This was exemplified by Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which bought up oil refineries across the nation to control the entire oil industry. Vertical integration, on the other hand, involved controlling all stages of production, from raw materials to final products. Andrew Carnegie's Steel Company is a prime example of vertical integration, as it controlled everything from iron ore extraction to steel production and distribution. Trusts and holding companies. To further consolidate power, industrialists often formed trusts or holding companies. A trust was an arrangement where companies would give their stock to a central board of trustees, who would then control the companies as a single entity. This allowed for the creation of massive, monopolistic corporations. One of the most famous examples was Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust, which held controlling interests in nearly every oil company in the United States. These trusts were often accused of stifling competition, inflating prices, and exploiting workers, leading to public outrage. Labor unions and workers' struggles. While big business and industrial expansion created enormous wealth for some, the Gilded Age was also a time of intense labor unrest and exploitation. Factory workers, miners, and railroad employees often worked long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. Child labor was rampant, and many workers, including immigrants, lived in poverty. In response to these conditions, labor unions began to form to advocate for workers' rights. The rise of labor unions. The Gilded Age saw the birth of several important labor unions, including the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, AFL. The Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, was one of the first national labor organizations and advocated for an 8-hour workday, better wages, and improved working conditions. The AFL, founded by Samuel Gompers in 1886, focused on gaining better wages and conditions for skilled workers. While these unions achieved some successes, their efforts were often met with resistance from business owners, who were able to use their wealth and influence to suppress strikes and discourage union membership. Strikes and violent confrontations. The Gilded Age was marked by several high-profile labor strikes, some of which ended in violence. One of the most infamous was the Pullman Strike of 1894, which began when workers at the Pullman Company, a major railroad manufacturer, went on strike to protest wage cuts and high rents in company-owned housing. The strike escalated and spread to other cities, eventually paralyzing rail transportation across the nation. The federal government intervened, sending in troops to break the strike, and several workers were killed in the ensuing clashes. This and other strikes highlighted the growing tensions between labor and business during the Gilded Age. Political corruption and the role of government. The rapid growth of big business during the Gilded Age also coincided with widespread political corruption. Many of the nation's wealthiest industrialists had close ties to politicians, and often used their influence to secure favorable legislation, government contracts, and land grants. The political system of the Gilded Age was marked by machine politics, in which political parties, especially in urban centers like New York and Chicago, were controlled by political bosses who traded patronage and favors for votes. The most notorious example of political corruption during this period was the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City, led by figures like William Boss Tweed. Tweed and his associates used their control of the city's government to steal millions of dollars from public funds through kickbacks. Br. The Progressive Era, spanning from the 1890s to the 1920s, was a period of widespread social, political, and economic reforms aimed at addressing the negative consequences of industrialization, urbanization, and political corruption that had defined the Gilded Age. In response to the excesses of big business, labor exploitation, political corruption, and social inequality, reformers from diverse backgrounds sought to improve American society through a series of laws, movements, and constitutional changes. The ultimate goal of the Progressive Era was to bring about a more democratic, fair, and just society by empowering citizens, regulating business practices, and advancing social justice. Origins of the Progressive Movement. The Progressive Era was born out of the tensions created by the rapid economic expansion of the Gilded Age. While industrialization had brought tremendous wealth and technological advancements, it also led to widespread social inequality, environmental degradation, and concentrated power in the hands of a few wealthy business magnates. Many middle-class reformers, labor activists, and intellectuals became alarmed by the negative consequences of unchecked capitalism and the monopolistic practices that had dominated the previous decades. Social inequality and the rise of reform movements. By the 1890s, many Americans were increasingly concerned about the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. The rapid growth of industrial cities had created a new urban working class, but many of these workers faced harsh conditions, low wages, and long hours. At the same time, wealth was increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few industrial titans. The rise of the labor movement and the increasing visibility of poverty and slum spurred calls for social reform. Intellectual and academic support. The Progressive Movement also benefited from the ideas of academics and intellectuals who believed that government action was necessary to solve society's problems. Social scientists like John Dewey and Lester Frank Ward argued that government should actively intervene in the economy and social life to ensure fairness and equality. The idea of scientific management also gained traction, with reformers advocating for the application of rational and systematic methods to solve social and economic problems. Key reforms and achievements of the Progressive Era. Regulation of big business. One of the central goals of the Progressive Era was to curb the power of monopolistic corporations and regulate business practices that were seen as exploitative. A key target was the growing influence of trusts and monopolies, which were perceived as suppressing competition and harming consumers. Progressive leaders pushed for stricter antitrust laws, regulatory agencies, and labor protections. Antitrust legislation. The Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, which had been passed in the Gilded Age, was initially weak and largely ineffective. However, during the Progressive Era, the federal government took more aggressive action to break up monopolies. Under President Theodore Roosevelt and later President William Howard Taft, the government launched numerous antitrust cases to break up giant monopolies in industries like oil, Standard Oil, and railroads. Roosevelt's trust-busting policies were aimed at curbing the excesses of big business while still allowing for the existence of efficient corporations. The creation of the Federal Trade Commission (FTC) in 1914 helped regulate business practices and prevent unfair monopolistic practices. The Hepburn Act, 1906, under Roosevelt's administration. The Hepburn Act was passed to give the Interstate Commerce Commission (ICC) more power to regulate railroad rates and practices. This marked a key step in the government's efforts to ensure fair business practices and reduce corporate abuses in transportation, which were seen as crucial for the functioning of the American economy. Political reforms and expanding democracy. Progressives believed that the political system needed reform to better serve the public and reduce the corrupting influence of big business and political machines. Key political reforms of the era were aimed at expanding democracy, improving government accountability, and giving more power to ordinary citizens. Direct election of senators, 17th Amendment, 1913. Prior to the passage of the 17th Amendment, U.S. senators were chosen by state legislatures, which were often subject to political corruption and corporate influence. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, allowed for the direct election of senators by the people, making the Senate more responsive to public opinion and reducing the power of state political bosses and big business interests in the legislative process. Initiative, referendum, and recall. In an effort to increase direct democracy and give citizens more control over the political process, many states introduced reforms such as the initiative, referendum, and recall. These allowed citizens to propose new laws, initiative, vote directly on laws, referendum, and remove elected officials from office before their terms expired, recall. These reforms helped to make government more accountable to the people and reduce the influence of political machines and corruption in state politics. Women's suffrage, 19th Amendment, 1920. The struggle for women's rights was one of the most significant movements of the Progressive era. Led by activists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul, women demanded the right to vote. After decades of activism, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote and representing a major victory for social reform. Women's suffrage was not only a victory for gender equality but also a key step in expanding the democratic rights of all citizens. Social reforms and workers' rights. One of the most important goals of the Progressive era was to improve the lives of workers and the urban poor. Labor conditions in the Gilded Age were often harsh, with long hours, unsafe working conditions, and little recourse for workers who were injured or mistreated. Progressives sought to address these issues through both federal and state-level reforms. Child labor laws. Child labor was rampant during the Gilded Age, with young children working in factories, coal mines, and textile mills under dangerous and exploitative conditions. Progressive reformers, led by figures like Florence Kelley and the National Child Labor Committee, campaigned for laws that restricted child labor and required children to attend school. These efforts culminated in the establishment of child labor laws at the state level, although national reforms would take longer to be enacted. Labor rights and workplace safety. In addition to child labor laws, progressives also pushed for better working conditions for adult workers. The establishment of workplace safety regulations, limits on working hours, and the creation of compensation laws for workers injured on the job were important achievements of the era. The creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, and workers' compensation laws in the early 20th century reflected the growing concern for workers' well-being. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, 1911. This tragic event, in which 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, died in a factory fire, highlighted the dangerous working conditions that still existed in many industries. The fire led to widespread public outcry and prompted significant reforms in workplace safety, including the establishment of fire safety codes and regulations around building inspections, which helped improve working conditions for future generations. The environmental movement and conservation. Another key aspect of the Progressive era was the rise of the conservation movement. Industrialization and urbanization had placed considerable strain on the natural environment, and many progressives became concerned about the depletion of natural resources and the destruction of wilderness areas. The conservation movement. Leaders like Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir helped establish the foundations for modern environmentalism. Roosevelt, in particular, used his presidency to create national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges, protecting millions of acres of land from commercial development. His administration created the U.S. Forest Service and helped establish the National Park Service, ensuring that natural landscapes would be preserved for future generations. This era also saw the establishment of many national parks, including Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, which became symbols of America's commitment to environmental conservation. Environmental protection. Along with preserving natural areas, progressives sought to improve public health and the quality of life in cities. They advocated for cleaner air and water, better sanitation, and the regulation of industries that polluted the environment. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, would come much later, but the Progressive Era laid the groundwork for future environmental reforms. The role of women in the Progressive Movement. Women played a crucial role in the Progressive Era, both as activists and as key figures in advocating for social and political reforms. While the fight for women's suffrage was the most prominent issue, women also led efforts to address child labor, improve public health, and fight for better working conditions. Figures like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in Chicago, played a pivotal role in addressing the needs of immigrants and the urban poor. The Settlement House movement, which sought to provide education, healthcare, and other services to impoverished communities, was an important part of the Progressive Era's social reform efforts. Challenges and limitations of the Progressive Era. Despite the many successes of the Progressive Movement, it was not without its challenges and limitations. Not all groups benefited equally from the reforms of the era. African Americans, for example, were largely excluded from the benefits of progressive reforms, particularly in the South, where Jim Crow laws continued to institutionalize racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Progressives also struggled to address the full scope of issues affecting racial minorities, immigrants, and the poor in rural areas. Furthermore, while the Progressive Era advanced the cause of women's rights, the movement was often divided along racial lines, with white suffragists sometimes excluding or sidelining the concerns of African American women. The movement's focus on middle-class, white, and native-born Americans led to limitations in its ability. World War I, 1914 to 1918, though it involved many nations, had a profound and transformative impact on the United States, both domestically and internationally. Prior to the war, the U.S. had been primarily focused on its own domestic affairs and had followed a foreign policy of isolationism, aiming to avoid entanglement in European conflicts. However, the Great War would act as a catalyst that not only reshaped American foreign policy, but also propelled the U.S. into the status of a global power, signaling the country's emergence as a dominant international force. The war's outcome would alter the global balance of power, and the U.S. would play a key role in shaping the post-war world order. America's initial stance and neutrality. At the outset of World War I in 1914, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, initially sought to remain neutral. America's geographic distance from Europe, along with a strong tradition of avoiding foreign entanglements as seen in the Monroe Doctrine and the post-Civil War era, made neutrality a popular stance. Additionally, the U.S. had significant commercial interests in both the Allied and Central Powers, making it difficult to take sides without risking economic and diplomatic fallout. Economic ties to both sides. Although the U.S. declared neutrality, its economy was heavily intertwined with the warring nations, especially Great Britain and France. American banks and businesses, particularly those in manufacturing, trade, and agriculture, were heavily invested in supplying war materials, loans, and goods to the Allied powers. As the war escalated, American trade with the Allies increased significantly, while trade with the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, became increasingly difficult due to British naval blockades and German unrestricted submarine warfare. German submarine warfare. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, where German U-boats would sink any ship, including neutral ones, in the waters around Britain, became a turning point for American neutrality. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, which killed 128 Americans, shocked the American public and led to calls for intervention. Although Germany had promised to halt such attacks, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 pushed the U.S. closer to war. The Zimmermann Telegram, another critical event that led to American entry into the war, was the interception of the Zimmermann Telegram in early 1917. This was a secret communication from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico, in which Germany promised Mexico the return of lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if Mexico joined the war against the United States. The revelation of this secret agreement further angered the American public and solidified the argument for U.S. intervention. America joins the war. In April 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, framing the conflict as a fight to make the world safe for democracy. The decision to enter the war marked a major departure from the country's traditional isolationism and set the stage for a profound transformation of its global position. Mobilization of resources. Once the U.S. entered the war, it needed to mobilize its resources for a large-scale military engagement. The American government quickly ramped up military recruitment, with more than 4.7 million Americans eventually serving in the armed forces. The Selective Service Act, 1917, instituted a draft, leading to the rapid expansion of the U.S. Army. The industrial and agricultural sectors also geared up to support the war effort, with factories converting to the production of war materials, foodstuffs, and weapons. Economic support for allies. While America was still in the early stages of military mobilization, the U.S. government also increased its financial support to the Allied powers. By 1917, American banks had loaned billions of dollars to Britain, France, and Russia, providing the Allies with the financial resources needed to continue fighting. American industries, particularly steel, oil, and munitions, supplied essential war materials. U.S. economic assistance helped keep the Allies afloat, as the Central Powers, particularly Germany, faced severe shortages and economic blockades. America's role on the battlefields. While the American Expeditionary Force, AEF, under General John J. Pershing did not arrive in Europe in large numbers until 1918, its involvement was crucial in tipping the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. The AEF fought in key battles on the Western Front, contributing to the collapse of German morale and the eventual armistice. The Battle of Cantigny, May 1918, the first major U.S. engagement in France, the Battle of Cantigny demonstrated the effectiveness of the American troops. Although the battle itself was relatively small, it marked a significant achievement, as U.S. forces captured the town and held it against German counterattacks. It was an early signal that American forces could contribute meaningfully to the Allied war effort. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, September-November 1918, the largest and most significant American military engagement during the war was the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It was part of the final Allied push that led to the armistice and the end of the war. Over 1.2 million American soldiers participated in this offensive, which lasted from September 26 to November 11, 1918. The offensive was instrumental in breaking the German lines and forcing them into retreat, contributing significantly to the ultimate defeat of the Central Powers. The influence of American troops. One of the critical contributions of the U.S. forces was not just the military engagement, but the psychological and strategic boost they provided to the Allies. The arrival of fresh, well-supplied American troops bolstered the morale of the exhausted Allied forces, who had been engaged in trench warfare for years. German forces, already weakened by constant fighting and dwindling resources, were unable to withstand the combined pressure of U.S. troops, fresh Allied reinforcements, and an increasingly effective blockade. The end of the war and the Treaty of Versailles. By the fall of 1918, the Central Powers were on the brink of collapse. In November, Germany sought an armistice, and the fighting came to an end. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, formally ended the war. President Wilson, who had become a leading voice in the peace talks, proposed his famous 14 points, which were designed to create a more just and lasting peace. Key elements of his plan included the establishment of the League of Nations, self-determination for nations, and the reduction of military armaments. The League of Nations. Wilson's most ambitious vision was the creation of the League of Nations, an international organization aimed at resolving conflicts and maintaining global peace through diplomacy rather than warfare. Although Wilson believed the League would help prevent future conflicts and promote cooperation among nations, the U.S. Senate ultimately rejected membership, largely due to concerns over entangling the country in international alliances. Despite this setback, the League of Nations became a precursor to the United Nations, established after World War II. Punitive measures against Germany. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh punitive measures on Germany, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and heavy reparations. While Wilson initially advocated for a more conciliatory peace, the French and British pushed for a treaty that would weaken Germany and prevent it from ever threatening Europe again. The treaty's severe terms were controversial and contributed to the political and economic instability in Germany that would later play a role in the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II. The U.S. becomes a global power. America's involvement in World War I had far-reaching consequences. The U.S. emerged from the war as a global power, both militarily and economically. Although the country retreated into isolationism in the 1920s, the events of the war had positioned the U.S. as an economic and military giant, with its influence now felt across the globe. Economic dominance. The United States, having loaned and supplied vast amounts of money and goods to the Allied powers, emerged from the war with a booming economy. Europe, on the other hand, was devastated by the war's destruction and the economic strain of rebuilding. As a result, the U.S. became the world's leading economic power, a status that would be reinforced in the decades to come. Military power and global influence. The U.S. military, having demonstrated its strength and effectiveness in the war, gained a reputation as a formidable force. The nation also began to play a larger role in global diplomacy, even though it would not formally join the League of Nations. The U.S. would begin to take a more active role in global affairs, particularly in the economic and political spheres, as seen in its involvement in peacekeeping, financial support for rebuilding Europe, and shaping international trade policies. Cultural impact and Americanization. The post-war period also saw the rise of American cultural and political influence around the world. American ideals of democracy, capitalism, and individual liberty gained traction, and U.S. cultural products, such as Hollywood films, jazz music, and consumer goods, began to shape global culture. The war had helped to establish the U.S. as the central figure in the 20th century world order, a position it would retain through World War II and beyond. Thus, World War I was a pivotal moment in the history of the United States. It not only marked the nation's entry into the international arena but also set the stage for its eventual role as a superpower in the global order. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash of 1929 and lasted throughout the 1930s, was the most severe and prolonged economic downturn in modern history. It had profound effects on the American economy, society, and the nation's position in the world. While the Depression dramatically undermined economic stability and caused widespread suffering, it also set the stage for transformative changes in U.S. domestic and foreign policies, helping the United States ultimately recover and emerge as an even more dominant global power. The crisis reshaped the relationship between the government and the economy, laying the groundwork for America's later role in the global economic system. The causes and initial effects of the Great Depression. The Great Depression had multiple causes, including overspeculation in the stock market, the collapse of the agricultural sector, and weaknesses in the banking system. The early 1920s had seen a period of rapid economic growth, but that prosperity was built on fragile financial practices. By the late 1920s, many banks had invested heavily in stocks, and farmers, especially in the Midwest, were struggling with falling commodity prices. The stock market crash of 1929. The stock market crash in October 1929 was a pivotal event that exposed the instability in the American economy. Over-leveraged investors were wiped out as stock prices plummeted, causing widespread panic. The crash precipitated a chain reaction, leading to a sharp contraction in credit, a fall in consumer spending, and the closure of thousands of banks. As confidence in the market collapsed, businesses cut back on production, leading to mass unemployment. By 1933, unemployment had reached around 25%, and millions of Americans were left destitute. Bank failures and unemployment. The collapse of the banking system compounded the economic crisis. With banks failing at unprecedented rates, the money supply shrank, further deepening the economic slump. Unemployment soared as businesses closed, and industrial production fell sharply. The unemployment rate reached its peak in 1933, leaving about 1 in 4 workers without a job. The impact on American families was devastating, as people lost their homes, savings, and access to basic goods and services. Global repercussions. While the Depression began in the United States, it quickly spread to other parts of the world. Global trade collapsed as tariffs and protectionist policies were enacted by countries around the world. The U.S., having been one of the largest creditors and financial centers in the world, saw its economic decline reverberate globally. Many European nations, already weakened by the aftermath of World War I, saw their economies collapse under the strain of the Depression. This worldwide economic turmoil contributed to the rise of extremist political movements, including fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, setting the stage for World War II. The domestic response, the New Deal and its long-term impact. The Great Depression fundamentally reshaped the American political landscape. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, running on a platform of bold, comprehensive reforms to combat the economic crisis. Roosevelt's New Deal sought to provide immediate relief to the unemployed, reform the financial system, and stimulate economic recovery through public works projects and reforms aimed at preventing future depressions. The New Deal's relief, recovery, and reform programs. The New Deal was composed of a series of programs and policies aimed at addressing the three R's: relief, providing immediate assistance to the unemployed and the poor, recovery, stimulating economic growth and industrial recovery, and reform, creating laws and structures to prevent future financial crises. Key New Deal programs included the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, which provided jobs for young men in public works projects, such as planting trees, building national parks, and constructing infrastructure. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, which employed millions of people in the construction of public buildings, roads, schools, and other infrastructure projects, while also supporting the arts and cultural programs. The Social Security Act, 1935, which created a system of unemployment insurance, retirement benefits, and aid for disabled individuals, marking the beginning of the modern welfare state. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which sought to stabilize the economy by regulating industries and labor relations, although it was later struck down by the Supreme Court. The impact on the U.S. economy and society. While the full recovery from the Depression would take years, the New Deal helped to mitigate the worst effects of the economic downturn. It provided a safety net for millions of Americans, while the large-scale public works programs and social programs helped stabilize the economy. The New Deal also led to the growth of the federal government, as it took on new roles in regulating the economy, overseeing the stock market, and providing social welfare. The economic system was restructured, and the relationship between the state and its citizens fundamentally changed, with the federal government assuming greater responsibility for ensuring economic stability and social security. Banking reforms. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial banking from investment banking, reducing the risk of speculative investments that had contributed to the 1929 crash. Additionally, the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, insured bank deposits, restoring confidence in the banking system and encouraging people to reinvest their savings into the economy. Labor rights. The National Labor Relations Act, 1935, also known as the Wagner Act, provided legal support for workers' rights to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. It marked a major shift towards supporting labor in its ongoing struggle for fair wages, better working conditions, and job security. These changes helped to build a more equitable society and provided workers with a political and economic voice. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash of 1929 and lasted throughout the 1930s, was the most severe and prolonged economic downturn in modern history. It had profound effects on the American economy, society, and the nation's position in the world. While the Depression dramatically undermined economic stability and caused widespread suffering, it also set the stage for transformative changes in U.S. domestic and foreign policies, helping the United States ultimately recover and emerge as an even more dominant global power. The crisis reshaped the relationship between the government and the economy, laying the groundwork for America's later role in the global economic system. The causes and initial effects of the Great Depression. The Great Depression had multiple causes, including overspeculation in the stock market, the collapse of the agricultural sector, and weaknesses in the banking system. The early 1920s had seen a period of rapid economic growth, but that prosperity was built on fragile financial practices. By the late 1920s, many banks had invested heavily in stocks, and farmers, especially in the Midwest, were struggling with falling commodity prices. The stock market crash of 1929. The stock market crash in October 1929 was a pivotal event that exposed the instability in the American economy. Over-leveraged investors were wiped out as stock prices plummeted, causing widespread panic. The crash precipitated a chain reaction, leading to a sharp contraction in credit, a fall in consumer spending, and the closure of thousands of banks. As confidence in the market collapsed, businesses cut back on production, leading to mass unemployment. By 1933, unemployment had reached around 25%, and millions of Americans were left destitute. Bank failures and unemployment. The collapse of the banking system compounded the economic crisis. With banks failing at unprecedented rates, the money supply shrank, further deepening the economic slump. Unemployment soared as businesses closed, and industrial production fell sharply. The unemployment rate reached its peak in 1933, leaving about 1 in 4 workers without a job. The impact on American families was devastating, as people lost their homes, savings, and access to basic goods and services. Global repercussions. While the Depression began in the United States, it quickly spread to other parts of the world. Global trade collapsed as tariffs and protectionist policies were enacted by countries around the world. The U.S., having been one of the largest creditors and financial centers in the world, saw its economic decline reverberate globally. Many European nations, already weakened by the aftermath of World War I, saw their economies collapse under the strain of the Depression. This worldwide economic turmoil contributed to the rise of extremist political movements, including fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, setting the stage for World War II. The domestic response, the New Deal and its long-term impact. The Great Depression fundamentally reshaped the American political landscape. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, running on a platform of bold, comprehensive reforms to combat the economic crisis. Roosevelt's New Deal sought to provide immediate relief to the unemployed, reform the financial system, and stimulate economic recovery through public works projects and reforms aimed at preventing future depressions. The New Deal's relief, recovery, and reform programs. The New Deal was composed of a series of programs and policies aimed at addressing the three R's: relief, providing immediate assistance to the unemployed and the poor; recovery, stimulating economic growth and industrial recovery; and reform, creating laws and structures to prevent future financial crises. Key New Deal programs included the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, which provided jobs for young men in public works projects, such as planting trees, building national parks, and constructing infrastructure. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, which employed millions of people in the construction of public buildings, roads, schools, and other infrastructure projects, while also supporting the arts and cultural programs. The Social Security Act, 1935, which created a system of unemployment insurance, retirement benefits, and aid for disabled individuals, marking the beginning of the modern welfare state. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which sought to stabilize the economy by regulating industries and labor relations, although it was later struck down by the Supreme Court. The impact on the U.S. economy and society. While the full recovery from the Depression would take years, the New Deal helped to mitigate the worst effects of the economic downturn. It provided a safety net for millions of Americans, while the large-scale public works programs and social programs helped stabilize the economy. The New Deal also led to the growth of the federal government, as it took on new roles in regulating the economy, overseeing the stock market, and providing social welfare. The economic system was restructured, and the relationship between the state and its citizens fundamentally changed, with the federal government assuming greater responsibility for ensuring economic stability and social security. Banking reforms. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial banking from investment banking, reducing the risk of speculative investments that had contributed to the 1929 crash. Additionally, the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, insured bank deposits, restoring confidence in the banking system and encouraging people to reinvest their savings into the economy. Labor rights. The National Labor Relations Act, 1935, also known as the Wagner Act, provided legal support for workers' rights to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. It marked a major shift towards supporting labor in its ongoing struggle for fair wages, better working conditions, and job security. These changes helped to build a more equitable society and provided workers with a political and economic voice. World War II, 1939 to 1945, was a pivotal moment in world history, and for the United States, it represented both a critical turning point and the definitive moment that solidified its status as a global superpower. The war fundamentally reshaped not only the political landscape of the world, but also the economic and military foundations of the United States. America's involvement in the war transformed its domestic economy, reshaped its foreign policy, and positioned it at the center of the post-war international order. Through a combination of military victories, economic dominance, and diplomatic leadership, the United States emerged from World War II as one of the two superpowers in the world, alongside the Soviet Union. The United States' entry into the war. Though the war began in 1939, the U.S. remained officially neutral for the first 2 years. Public opinion was largely against entering another European conflict, especially after the horrors of World War I. However, the strategic and economic dynamics of the war soon made American involvement inevitable. The attack on Pearl Harbor. The turning point for U.S. involvement came with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The surprise assault on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which resulted in significant loss of life and military assets, galvanized the American public and led to the United States declaring war on Japan the following day. Just days later, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, declared war on the United States, pulling the U.S. fully into the global conflict. The arsenal of democracy. Once the U.S. entered the war, the country quickly mobilized its vast industrial and human resources. The U.S. transformed itself into the arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it. The country shifted from a peacetime economy to a war economy, with factories converting to produce weapons, tanks, ships, airplanes, and munitions. American manufacturing prowess, coupled with technological innovation, gave the Allies a critical edge. By 1943, the U.S. was producing more war materials than any other country, including the Axis powers combined. The economic and industrial shift. World War II brought an end to the Great Depression. The mobilization of American industry led to a sharp drop in unemployment, as millions of Americans found work in war production, transportation, and military service. The U.S. government also spent massive sums on the war effort, spurring further economic growth. The war's economic benefits were not confined to military production. The agricultural sector also expanded to meet the demands of both the military and civilians around the world. Technological innovations. The war also led to significant advancements in technology and science. Key innovations such as the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, radically altered the course of the war and global geopolitics. The U.S. also developed cutting-edge radar, jet engines, and medical treatments like antibiotics, which would have far-reaching consequences for both the military and civilian sectors in the post-war era. The United States fought on two major fronts, Europe and the Pacific, against two powerful Axis powers, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The U.S. military's involvement was crucial in turning the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. The U.S. also formed critical alliances with the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and other nations to fight the Axis powers. The European theater. The U.S. played a central role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, which involved a massive Allied landing on the beaches of France, was a decisive turning point in the war. American and British forces, supported by other Allied nations, liberated France and continued their push eastward, eventually capturing Berlin in May 1945. U.S. forces were also instrumental in the Battle of the Bulge, which was Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. Throughout the European campaign, the U.S. contributed not only military strength but also critical strategic planning and leadership. The Pacific Theater. The war in the Pacific was marked by brutal island-hopping campaigns and significant naval battles. The U.S. Navy, with the help of Marine Corps and Army forces, fought a series of fierce engagements to recapture islands held by Japan. Major victories, such as the Battle of Midway, 1942, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 1944, shifted the balance of power in the Pacific in favor of the Allies. The Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were among the fiercest and bloodiest engagements, signaling Japan's determination to fight to the bitter end. The use of atomic weapons, one of the most significant moments in the Pacific Theater and in world history, was the U.S. decision to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The bombings led to Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, bringing an end to World War II. The use of atomic bombs also marked the beginning of the nuclear age, forever altering international relations and military strategy. Strategic leadership and global coordination. In addition to military victories, the United States provided vital leadership and strategic coordination among the Allies. Roosevelt's diplomatic efforts, alongside key military leaders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, helped coordinate the Allied war effort across multiple theaters of operation. The collaboration between the U.S., the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom was crucial in ensuring that the Axis powers were defeated on both the European and Pacific fronts. Post-war economic and political influence. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States had not only been a key player in achieving the Allies' victory but had also positioned itself as the world's dominant economic, military, and diplomatic power. The aftermath of World War II reshaped the international order and cemented America's status as the principal architect of the post-war world. The economic superpower, unlike many European and Asian countries, which were devastated by the war's destruction, the United States emerged from the conflict with its industrial base intact. The U.S. economy, having been transformed into a wartime production powerhouse, was poised for further growth. The United States had the world's largest economy, abundant natural resources, and a highly productive labor force. U.S. corporations dominated international markets, and American goods, from automobiles to household products, flooded global markets. This economic dominance laid the foundation for American leadership in international finance and trade for decades to come. The Bretton Woods system and the IMF. In 1944, as World War II was nearing its end, the U.S. played a central role in creating the Bretton Woods system, which established a new international monetary order. The system created institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, both of which were designed to promote economic stability, facilitate reconstruction, and prevent another global depression. The U.S. dollar was pegged to gold, and most other currencies were tied to the dollar, making the U.S. dollar the world's primary reserve currency. This ensured that the United States remained at the center of global economic activity. The Marshall Plan. In 1947, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program designed to help rebuild war-torn Europe. Over the next 4 years, the U.S. provided more than $12 billion, equivalent to over $130 billion today, in economic assistance to Western Europe, which helped stabilize economies, rebuild infrastructure, and prevent the spread of communism. The success of the Marshall Plan not only solidified American influence in Europe but also laid the groundwork for the economic recovery of Western Europe and the creation of the European Economic Community, EEC, a precursor to the European Union. The establishment of the United Nations. In 1945, the U.S. was a founding member of the United Nations, UN, an international organization created to promote peace, security, and cooperation among nations. The U.S. played a leading role in shaping the UN structure and charter. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the U.S. was granted veto power over major decisions, further cementing its role as the world's principal superpower and enforcer of international law. The rise of the Cold War. While World War II had united the Allies in a common cause, it also highlighted the ideological divide between the United States and the Soviet Union. The U.S. championed liberal democracy, capitalism, and market economies, while the Soviet Union advocated for a totalitarian regime and state-controlled economies. By the late 1940s, tensions between these two superpowers had led to the Cold War, a geopolitical struggle that would dominate global politics for the next several decades. The U.S. positioned itself as the leader of the Western Bloc, with its influence spreading throughout Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia. The military superpower. The United States emerged from World War II with the most powerful military in the world. Not only did the U.S. possess a massive conventional military force, but it was also the only country to possess nuclear weapons at the end of the war. This military dominance, combined with the economic resources to maintain it, ensured that the U.S. would be a central player in international security and military alliances. The establishment of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949 further cemented U.S. military leadership, as the country took a leading role in defending Western Europe against the perceived Soviet threat. Cultural dominance and soft power. In addition to its economic and military dominance, the United States also began to exert significant cultural influence globally. American films, music, fashion, and technology became popular around the world, symbolizing modernity, freedom, and prosperity. Hollywood films, jazz music, and consumer goods became powerful symbols of American life and ideals. This soft power helped promote American values, spread its cultural influence, and fostered global goodwill.